Welcome back to Homemaking Without Fear. It has been a long time since I have filmed a video like this, and I am so glad to be back at it. As many of you know, I've been sick for quite a while and I'm finally feeling a little bit better, and I thought I would do a video for you. So I'm really excited to do this. I have been writing a few recipes for the blog, but have been largely just resting and spending time with my family. But I have the energy today to film a video, so we're gonna do this. My most recent post is all about keeping a sourdough starter the easy way. I don't know about you, but kiddos to take care of and animals and moving into a new home, we all have a lot going on, and I cannot add a sourdough starter that I have to babysit every single day to my to-do list. I just can't do it. I would kill it. So I had to find an easier way to bake healthier bread, continue to bake sourdough like I love, and just make it easier. So I'm excited today to show you how I keep my dry sourdough the easy way. There are no daily feedings. There are no discards. I also thought it would be a perfect time to do a reveal of my kitchen. So you'll be getting lots of photos and footage of my brand new kitchen. So I thought baking a loaf of bread would be a great way to showcase my new kitchen and share with you guys. Check the links and resources below this video, and I'll make sure to share all of my kitchen design tips and vision boards with you too. If you are new here, I welcome you, and why don't you go check out homemakingwithoutfear.com and make sure that you subscribe to the YouTube channel and check out all the other videos that I have for you. Okay, so let's first talk about sourdough just a little tiny bit and what I mean when I say a dry starter and a wet starter. So a traditional sourdough starter is typically kept out on the counter at room temperature. It may be kept in a mason jar or some sort of container with a loose fitting lid, right? And every day you have to discard most of the starter, feed what is left, a 1-to-1 ratio, and you would repeat this process. You would use your starter to bake bread when it reaches its peak of bubbly risenness. Next day you would repeat the process. So every day you have to discard most of your sourdough starter and use it. Truly discard it if you can't use it, and then feed it. And this process goes on and on and on. You end up using lots of flour. It takes up lots of time, and if you miss a few days, your starter can get kind of skunky and weird and a little bit weak. So it takes up a lot of time. It takes up resources. Flour's not as easy to come by as it used to be, and everything is getting expensive. So the way that I keep my starter to save time and resources is I keep it in my refrigerator. So this is actually a piece of my mother starter that I mixed up for a friend, and I left it out at room temperature because I'm going to be giving it to her. This is a drier starter than most of you are probably used to, but as you can see, it's nice and active and happy and bubbly, and it's just been in the fridge for a couple days waiting to pass along to her. But my actual starter I call my mother starter. So this is a sourdough starter I made 3 years ago, and I'll put a link in the description if you were interested in making your own starter from scratch. But a great way to get some starter is to get a little bit from a friend. You only need about a tablespoon or so, which is about 30 grams, to get your own starter going. So that's a great way to start making sourdough. So again, this is my starter that I made myself, and I keep it in a crock with a tight-fitting lid, which is different than most starters, and I also keep it in the refrigerator. And I am almost out, so we're gonna do a couple things with it today, but I do not feed it daily. I don't discard at all. I hate wasting food. You don't have to waste the discard, but I can't make bread products every single day. My body doesn't like that kind of lifestyle. I feed my starter about every 5 loaves of bread. The key is to never let your mother starter get less than a tablespoon, which is again about 30 grams. As long as you have 30 grams of mother starter left, you can feed it and keep it active, keep it in the refrigerator, and continue to use it. So my starter is kept in the refrigerator. I don't feed it very often. And when I do feed it, I feed a different ratio. So I don't feed my starter a 1-to-1 ratio like the traditional room temperature starter would be fed. I feed mine a 2-to-1, which means I feed it 2 parts flour to 1 part water. When I feed my starter, I want to have 30 grams of mother starter, 100 grams of an all-purpose flour or a whole wheat flour or rye flour, and 50 grams of water, warm water. This starter actually mixes up like a soft dough. It's not soupy or pancake batter. It's a completely different consistency, and that's what you want. So we call it that a dry starter, and it's not really dry, but it's a lot drier than the traditional starter. Traditional starters usually around 100% hydration, the 1-to-1 ratio. So this is half that hydration, but you can still bake beautiful loaves of bread, and I'm going to show you how to do it. But let's talk about how you would use this starter to bake a loaf of bread. All sourdough breads require active starter, right? It needs to be at its peak or close to it of its active bubbly stage in order to get a good sourdough result, a good sour flavor, a good rise in your loaf. If your starter is kept out at room temperature, you're gonna feed it before you make your loaf of bread, okay? Well, you're gonna do the same thing with your cold, dry mother starter. But what you're going to mix up and make before you bake your bread is called levain or leaven. Literally the word leaven means to rise up, to give loft. A little bit of leaven lightens the whole lump, right? With the cold mother starter, we are gonna mix up a levain that makes the mother starter become an active starter that we will use in our bread recipes. This will make more sense as we go along, I promise. But let's gather up some materials and tools and get ready to feed my starter, and together we'll mix up a levain so that I can bake a loaf of bread tomorrow.
There's something different about us, and the reason why we stay. We fly around like paper planes, they never know where we will fall. Nobody can see us, still they wanna tear us apart. There's something different about the way we are. There's something different about us. Pouring cup after cup after cup. Yeah, it's just the way we do it. Anything just to block out the real life, real life. Yeah, we're loving the way they think we're so messed up. Even if what we're doing is bad.
All right, so I have everything I need to mix up a levain and also feed my sourdough starter. I also have a sourdough boule proofing in the refrigerator from yesterday, and we're gonna go ahead and bake that together at the very end of this process. So I'll share with you how I like to score my sourdough and how you can make a beautiful artisan loaf. Okay, so let's first make the levain. I use a kitchen scale. I got mine off Amazon. I'll drop a link below if you need one. I recommend weighing your ingredients instead of actually measuring, because measuring cups are just, they're not very accurate. Depending on who makes the measuring cup, it's up to interpretation. Who says what a half a cup is, right? So I like to set my scale to weigh in grams. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that. Ounces, mils, pounds, grams. Okay. And I'm gonna mix my levain up in a glass pitcher here. Let me give you a better look at what's going on. I'm going to set my container on my scale and I'm going to zero the weight. So we are at 0 grams. The recipe I like to use to make a levain is 100 grams of warm water. Okay, 100 grams of warm water. And then we take and zero this out. So we're back to 0 grams. And I'm gonna add about a tablespoon of my starter, which is 30 grams. So remember, this is my cold, straight from the fridge, dry, mostly dry anyway, mother starter. I last fed this probably 2 months ago, and I've made about 4 loaves of bread, and I have one to bake today. So we're definitely ready for feeding. All right, now that we have 30 grams of the mother starter, I'm just gonna give it a good mix. Just so we don't have big clumps of starter. Get it nice and dispersed. It's easier to do this right now before you add the flour. Okay, that looks pretty good. Grams. We're gonna zero out our scale again. And to the 30 grams of starter and the 100 grams of warm water, I'm going to add 80 grams of an all-purpose bread flour. You can use a whole wheat flour if you like. Rye flour is great. Whatever you like to use. Now we're gonna mix this up. Now you'll notice that the consistency of your levain is a lot like the traditional sourdough starter. It's more like pancake batter. That's exactly what you want. Basically, the step of making a levain is just like feeding a regular wet room temperature starter before you would bake bread. The only difference is you only take a piece of it straight from the fridge and activate it. So this levain is going to sit for 4 to up to 12 hours until it doubles, nice and bubbly and active, and this is what you would use as your active starter in any recipe that calls for active sourdough starter. You definitely want to cover it when you set it on the counter. I'm not going to put a tight lid, I'm just going to lightly set the lid on there. I like to use a glass container when feeding the mother starter so that I can keep an eye on it. All right, so there's our mixed levain, and I have the rubber band marking our starting level just so we can watch it bubble and rise up, because that's just kind of fun. I'm fortunate to have a double oven. One side of it is smaller, and what I've really enjoyed doing is using the proof setting to get it just nice and warm inside there, because it's cold in Montana. We still have ice and snow outside. You want your levain to sit in a warm location, warm room temp location, to become active. Then you just use it in whatever bread recipe you like. And if you go to HOMEMAKING.com, I have a really easy, delicious, no-knead sourdough recipe for you. That's the recipe I use to mix up my sourdough bread that's in my fridge right here that we'll finish up at the end of the video. Go get that recipe. We're getting down to the last little bit, so it's time to feed it, but it's been a while since I fed it, which is great. That's exactly the point. All right, to feed my starter, I'm gonna go ahead and use the kitchen scale again, and I'm going to pop on a clean container and zero it out. We are going to use the dry sourdough ratio that I share on the website, which is a 2-to-1 ratio. That is 50 grams of water. There, 50 grams of water. And we're gonna zero it. 30 grams of starter, which, whew, I'm really getting down to the end of my starter. If there ends up being a little bit more than 30 grams, that's okay too. I'm gonna switch. That was close. I'm gonna go ahead and soak this so I can have a nice clean container to put my freshly fed sourdough in. All right, zeroing again. So remember, we did 50 grams of water, so now we need 100 grams of flour for this feeding. The extra flour in this method keeps the starter fed a little bit longer than the traditional 1-to-1. Feeding a starter with a 2-to-1 ratio gives your mother starter more flour, more food, more sugars to feed off of. So it's gonna be happy a lot longer. And you can go a lot further in between feedings. Now, if you wanted, you could keep this starter out on the counter and convert it back into a wet starter if you're doing a lot of baking. Say it's a holiday or in the middle of winter and you're just doing a lot more baking. So in the summertime, I don't bake a lot of bread, very little at all. So this is a great method for me during the summers or when we're on vacation. But when I want to make more sourdough bread, I can simply go back to the wet starter method by feeding a 1-to-1 ratio and keeping it out on the counter, doing my daily feedings, my daily discards, what have you, just like regular. But the beauty of this is if that's too much for you and you need to go back to a dry starter, you can go back and forth. Just make sure that before you convert a starter to this dry method, that it's nice and active and proven from the beginning. So you've made loaves of bread. It's not a brand new starter. So this is a great reason to get a piece of mother starter from a friend. If you already have a wet starter, you can simply convert it to a dry starter at any point. Just feed a 2-to-1 ratio, flour to water. So here is my dry starter. You can see that it is a lot drier than a traditional starter, which is more the consistency of the levain that we made. I like to take it out of the container that I mixed it in, give it a little bit of a knead, just say hello. It gets the starter going, introduces it to the natural yeast in the environment and on your hands, and that is exactly what sourdough starter is. Flour, water, and naturally collected yeasts. I have a nice clean container. I'm going to put my dry starter back in. I'm going to cover it with a tea towel and I'm going to put it in warm room temperature. Let it sit for 12 hours overnight. Let it become really active and bubbly. Once it's active and bubbly, you can put on a tight-fitting lid, pop it back in your fridge. You're good to go. Don't feed it again until you have 30 grams left, which is about 5 loaves of bread. There you go. It's that simple. Okay, so we learned about mother starter, what that actually means. So where all of your sourdough starter mixtures come from, whether you give it to a friend, whether you make a levain, you keep your mother starter. You never let it get lower than 30 grams. We've talked about a traditional starter and how it's fed 1-to-1 ratio of flour to water. We talked about a dry starter method that I like to use, which is fed a 2-to-1 flour to water ratio. We've talked about the difference between a starter and a levain. A levain is basically just the activated starter that is ready to bake bread. The recipe I showed you will yield about 1 cup of levain or 1 cup of active starter, which is plenty for most recipes. We talked about how to convert your wet starter to a dry starter. Simply take 30 grams of your existing wet starter and feed it at a 2-to-1 ratio. knead it a little bit, let it become active, pop it in your fridge and use it whenever you want. I also mentioned that you could go from dry back to a wet starter if you're in a season where you're baking a lot, or you have a party, or you have something going on where you need a lot of starter. Super simple. Take your starter out and feed it at a 1-to-1 ratio. Bulk up your starter, leave it at room temperature, and you'll have plenty for baking lots of bread. Okay, now the fun part. Today is Wednesday. On Sunday, I mixed up a levain from my cold mother starter. I let it become active and bubbly overnight. On Monday, I had a puking kid. I was gonna bake bread and it didn't happen. And you know what? That's life. The beautiful thing is I just mixed up the bread really quick, popped it in my proofing oven, and let it sit there overnight again. I made my levain in the first stage. I mixed up my bread recipe in the second stage, and I let it bulk ferment in a warm location for up to 12 hours. You could do a little bit longer, but you want it to rise and get poofy. I like to do this again in my proofing oven, although for sourdough, that's not really proofing. So that first rise when you mix up your bread and you're doing your stretch and folds, that is actually bulk fermentation. That is where all the yeast activity is happening, and you're getting your bubbles and you're getting that really sour flavor that we all love happening. Third stage is taking that fermented dough, stretching it out, folding it up, forming it into a beautiful loaf to bake. The fourth step is actually letting that formed loaf, whether you've made rolls, whether you've made a boule, whether you've made a traditional bread loaf, letting this proof. Now, proofing for sourdough is the last step before baking, and that can be done anywhere between 4 to 6, even longer, 4 to 6 hours, even longer if you proof in the refrigerator. I like to proof my sourdough in the refrigerator, and the way I do that is I take my formed loaf, pop it into my a flour banneton basket, cover it with a plastic bag, and pop it in the refrigerator. Proofing your sourdough in the refrigerator slows down the yeast activity. It's still happening, and you're still getting fermentation, and you're also letting it rest in the refrigerator. It's just letting the gluten network develop and also deepen your flavor. So it also gives me a lot of flexibility. So I can leave a formed loaf of sourdough in the refrigerator for up to 36 hours. And at any point I can bake it whenever I have time. So if you like to have your daily bread, just keep sourdough on rotation. You know, mix up your loaves, feed your starter, keep one in the refrigerator so it's really quick and easy to pop a loaf of bread in the oven and bake one whenever you want. So I was gonna bake my loaf of bread yesterday, which was Tuesday. Still a sick kid, so it didn't happen. That's the beauty and flexibility of this. I'm gonna go ahead and pull that cold loaf out of the refrigerator. I'm gonna score it and we're gonna bake it together. And we'll have bread for dinner. Let's do it. Okay, let's pull this sourdough loaf out of the refrigerator. Again, this has been in my refrigerator since yesterday afternoon. It's not going to rise much at all as cold proofing, and that's okay. You're gonna get most of your rise in the bulk fermentation stage of sourdough. Having your dough cold like this will make it easier to score, and it will also allow a greater oven spring. So you're gonna have a beautifully risen and sprung loaf. I have my Dutch oven preheating and it's been in there a while, so it is nice and hot. Let's add a little bit of flour to the top. So I got my banneton basket, my bread lame, which is a tool to score the boule, on Amazon, and I'll go ahead and link this kit that I got if I can find it for you. Really reasonably priced. So there's lots of different ways to score sourdough. You can be very creative, you can keep it simple. A simple cross pattern is really beautiful. It opens up kind of like a flower. The traditional scoring half moon score will open up a beautiful ear on your sourdough. But no matter how you do it, you want to make sure to score one part deep enough for the steam to escape. If you don't do that, you're gonna have a side of your loaf blow out and it's gonna be funny looking. So we wanna go deeper than 1/2 inch and sometimes up to 2 inches. I'm looking at the top of my loaf and I'm holding my lame at a 45-degree angle. And I'm just gonna do the half moon ear. And because this is nice and cold, it's really easy to cut. So I'm in there about 1 inch. So that's my primary score on my bread. So that's where most of the expansion is gonna happen. Now we can get creative with some secondary scoring. These slices will be no more than 1/2 inch deep, approximately. So let's do that. Maybe we'll do a flower. So let's do a couple leaves. So all these slices will open up and be a lighter color than the crust of the bread. So how about that? Maybe another leaf here and here. Let's just keep it simple. Okay. Now I'm gonna get my really hot Dutch oven. All right, this oven is extremely hot. I'm gonna cut myself some little handles in the parchment so it's easier to lift in and out of the oven, but I don't have so much extra. Whew, that is hot. Okay, so we're just gonna lift up our loaf, place it in the oven, don't burn yourself. Cut off the bit of the extra. Okay. I like to use parchment, you don't have to. If you pop your loaf of bread in, give it a couple minutes and then slide it around, it will not stick. Parchment just helps it not stick and also makes it easier to remove. Okay, let's go ahead and put it in the oven. It was so nice to be back with you today and to bake bread and talk about sourdough. If you have any sourdough questions, make sure to leave them in the comments, or you can email me, kassy@homemaking.without-fear.com. Make sure to like, subscribe, and join me next time. Oh, I'll leave you with some parting stills and video of my kitchen. I'm absolutely loving it. Thank you for joining me today. Bye.